In the last section, we did a little refactor on our search bar component. In this video, I want to tell you a little bit about what's going on with the code inside of here, and then I'm going to tell you exactly what the difference is between a uncontrolled and controlled component. So first, what is going on with that code? Easiest way to explain this would be to show you a flow diagram of what is now happening inside of our component, and then for each step inside of here, we'll go back and refer to one of the different lines of code that we have. So first thing that happens is the user types in that input. And the instant they do, our callback gets invoked, the one that we are passing to onChange right here. So the instant a user types in that input, this function gets called, just as we were talking about a couple of videos ago. Then inside that callback, we pull the current value of the input, or whatever the user just typed in there, out of the event object. And we update our state on our component by calling setState. So right here inside the body of that callback, we take that event object, which we are abbreviating simply as E. We pull the change in that input out of that event object by referencing event.target.value. And then we update the state on our component with that new value. So now this .state.term is going to contain whatever the user just typed into that input. Now here's the important part. Remember, anytime we call setState, the component is going to automatically re-render itself. So the render method right here gets called a second time, the instant the user types something in there. And now here's the critical part. When the component re-renders, we take the value of that input, or we take our this.state.term right here, and we assign it to the value prop of the input. The value prop right there is going to essentially overwrite whatever text is already inside of the input. And I can demonstrate that to you very easily. Notice how I'm going to change this line right here. I'll change it to something like that. And now if I flip back over, you'll see that my text input right here now has all that gibberish I typed in. So whatever we assign to that value prop is what the input is going to show. So the net result of saying the value is this.state.term is we take whatever string is inside of this.state.term and we essentially push it into, or we shove it into the input. All right, so this entire series of changes, or this entire flow right here, is what constitutes a controlled element. With the refactor we just did, we now have a controlled element because we are now going through those steps. Before, we were not going through those steps and we had an uncontrolled element. Now let's talk about exactly what the difference between the two is and why we prefer controlled elements. All right, so another quick diagram here. Now this is a diagram of the code we had before we just did that refactor. So like the code we had like 2 videos ago before we refactored it to be a controlled component. So let's consider this diagram with the older version of the code. On the left-hand side, I've got a diagram of what I would call the React world. This is essentially all of our JavaScript code, all of our components, all of our classes, all that stuff. And then on the right-hand side is the HTML world. And this is essentially all of the HTML that is showing up inside of our application and displaying some information to the user. Now with the old version of our code, what would you say, or how would you answer if I asked you, what's the value of the input like right now? And when I say right now, I mean like basically at any instant in time. Well, with the older version of our code, the only way that we could somehow figure out what the value of our input was at any instant in time was to reach into the DOM, find that input element, and pull the value out of it. That was the only way that we could answer that question. We had to reach into the DOM and pull out the value. There was technically a time when our React component or our React code understood what the value of the input was, but that was only during the time that a user had actually typed something into the input and we had our callback invoked. So only during that very small, that very slim period of time when our callback was running, did the React component have any idea whatsoever what the value of the input was. During all other periods in time, the source of truth, so to speak, or the source of data inside of our application was inside of our HTML document, and it was not inside of our React component. And that's the key part to understand. You and I, as developers, we do not like to store information inside of our HTML elements. In the case that we had before we refactored it over to be controlled, the input tag itself was storing the value. It was the only thing inside of our entire application that knew what the value of the input was, and we don't like to do that. Instead, we want to centralize all of the information that we have inside of our React component. That's what we want to strive towards. We want to make sure that the React side of our application, it is what is driving all of the data that is flowing through our app. And we're not going to somehow store data inside the DOM. So let's look at the same diagram, but after we refactored it to be controlled. Okay, so here's what is happening now. So now if I ask you exactly what the value of the input is at any instant in time, you don't have to go over to the DOM. You don't have to look at the DOM. You don't have to somehow reference that input and pull the value out of it. Instead, we can look directly at our React component. We can look at its state object and see, oh, okay, my component has a term of hi there. That means that the value of my input must be hi there. And we were able to answer this question without having to try to dive into the DOM. In fact, if we tried to go into the DOM and we looked at that input, we would more or less be just told like, hey, like go look at the state to get the current value. I don't know what it is. At this point, we will not go into the DOM or find the input to find out what the current value is. We're going to always just make use of our React component. Okay, so that's the difference between a controlled and uncontrolled component. The key idea here is that we are storing our information inside of our components on our state property as opposed to storing information inside the DOM. That's the key thing to understand. Now, the challenging part about this, the part that seems really confusing, in my opinion, maybe you disagree with me, maybe it's crystal clear, but I feel as though for a lot of people, the hard thing to accept here is that when a user types in the input knows what the text is. You know, the input contains that text. We then call on change right here, and we inform our component like essentially after the fact of, hey, here's what the new text is in the input. And then when we re-render the component, we set the value on the input with essentially the value that is already in there. Remember, the input, it knows what is being typed in there, but we're kind of like overriding that and sticking a new value back in, and it's the same value that was already in there. So that's the part that I think for a lot of people is hard to kind of understand or accept. We're kind of like doing more work than is necessary here. But again, the entire idea is just to make sure that it's the React application driving and storing all of our data and not the HTML side of things. Now, even when I tell you this, you might say, oh, okay, like sure, we want React to drive everything and we want to store our information in components rather than in the DOM. But you know what? I don't care about that. I've worked with other applications before where we store information in the DOM and everything works out just fine. Maybe you fall in that category. Well, okay, I accept that. There are other frameworks out there, other JavaScript frameworks that store information in the DOM and they do just fine. But all I can tell you is this is how we do things in the React world. The good thing about this approach is that it makes doing certain steps pretty easy and pretty straightforward. For example, if I wanted to render my search bar with some default value inside the input, I could very easily change the initialization of the state term right here to say hi there. So now when my component first renders, the input will be rendered with a value of hi there. So now if I flip back over, we'll see that every time that my input first renders, I see the text hi there inside there by default. And of course, I can change it if I want to. And then every time I refresh, it'll just default back to hi there. All right, so that's kind of easy to do. We could very easily default the value of our search input. The other thing we can very easily do is manipulate whatever the user is typing in there for every single key press that they enter. So for example, let's say that we want to force this text input to always have capitalized values inside of it, no matter what the user types. So we don't want to let the user to put in lowercase characters. We always want to see uppercase like so. To do that, we would find right here where we get the callback for onChange, and we would say that we would take the user's value, whatever they just typed in, and we would just say to uppercase. We're going to take that value, we're going to force it to be uppercase. We'll then re-render the entire component, re-render the input right here, and force in a capitalized version of the value to it. So now I'll save this. And now when I type in here, I don't have my caps lock key on or anything like that. I am forced to enter capitalized keys. So certain operations get really, really easy when you start using controlled components. Doing something like this right here, forcing capitalized input, would be not impossible to do with traditional HTML events, like a traditional event listener on this input right here. It's not impossible by any means, but it would just be a little bit more challenging than by using a controlled component as we are over here. Okay, so I think we've spoken enough about controlled inputs. This is a topic that we're going to revisit many times throughout this course because it's not only for text inputs, it's for many other types of elements, like say a select option or radio buttons or checkboxes. All these different type of form inputs are all going to fall underneath this kind of controlled versus uncontrolled topic. So we'll get a lot of experience with this over time. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do here is remove the to uppercase, and I'll save. And now we're back to how we were before, where we could put in lowercase characters. Okay, so this looks good. Let's take a pause right here, and we'll continue in the next video.